In December of 1941, Singapore was the greatest fortress in the British Empire, and the men holding it did not believe it could fall. Then came one specific man, Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya. Outnumbered from the first hour to the last and running out of shells, he took that fortress in 70 days and forced the largest surrender in British history. But what exactly set him apart from every other general of that war? Let's take a closer look at Yamashita's 3 greatest tactical moves of the Malayan campaign. Shortly after midnight on the 8th of December, 1941, roughly 90 minutes before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Japanese transports dropped anchor off the beaches at Kota Baru in northeastern Malaya and off Singora and Patani on the Thai coast beyond the border. The 25th Army had come ashore. Yamashita had been offered 5 divisions for the operation. He asked for 3. He took the 5th Division, the 18th Division, and the Imperial Guards, and he went ashore with the leading troops at Singora himself, a heavy, broad-shouldered man in his 57th year, who intended to see the ground before his staff described it to him. Waiting for him was a garrison that believed the problem had already been solved. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival commanded some 88,000 British, Indian, Australian, and Malayan troops, and behind him stood the naval base at Sembawang and the great coastal batteries of the island. London had decided that tanks were unsuitable for Malayan terrain, so Percival had none. The jungle covering the spine of the peninsula was assessed as impassable to a formed body of troops, so the only serious defenses were laid across the roads. There was even a plan to stop the invasion before it began. Operation Matador would have pushed British troops north into Thailand to seize the Singora beaches first. On the 7th of December, with the Japanese convoy already sighted at sea, Air Chief Marshal Robert Brooke Popham hesitated, unwilling to violate Thai neutrality on the strength of a fleet that might be a decoy. Matador was never launched. The initiative was surrendered in the first hour of the war, and it was never recovered. Yamashita read the same map differently. Malaya had good roads, good rubber estate tracks, and a very large number of bicycles. His divisions had deliberately left theirs behind on the transports, expecting to seize what they needed on arrival. And they did. Roughly 6,000 cyclists rode with each division, 4 abreast, 40 and 50 men to a group, each man carrying up to 90 pounds of kit. In the heat, the tires burst, and the men simply rode on the bare rims. The noise of steel wheels hammering down a tarmac road at night, echoing through rubber trees, was heard by tired Indian battalions as the sound of approaching armor. A shortage had turned itself into a weapon. Where the British held a road, the Japanese fixed them in front and hooked through the jungle that could not be crossed, reappearing behind the block. Where the coast allowed it, small boats carried infantry around the flank to land in the rear. The results came fast. At Jitra, north of Alor Star, the 11th Indian Division held a prepared position, stocked and wired, to be defended for 3 months. On the evening of the 11th of December, the Sayeki detachment came down the road against it, an advance guard of perhaps 500 or 600 men at the point with a company of tanks behind them. Jitra held for about 15 hours. The 11th Indian Division lost more than 3,000 men, killed, wounded, and captured, roughly 200 every hour, along with some 50 field guns, 50 heavy machine guns, 300 vehicles, and 3 months of fuel, food, and ammunition that went straight into Japanese hands. Japanese losses were 27 killed and 83 wounded. At Asen nearby, a single Japanese cyclist rode onto the bridge and cut the demolition leads before the Gurkhas could blow it. The road south stayed open, and losing the north was not a local reverse. It was the loss of the airfields, and with them, the sky over the entire peninsula. Everything Yamashita did afterwards was already visible in that first fortnight. Move through the ground the enemy has written off as impassable. Keep the tempo so high that the enemy is always fighting yesterday's battle, and break his will before he discovers your weakness. Those 3 things became the hallmarks of his art of war, and they carried him almost to the sea, and there is a great deal more of this kind of breakdown for anyone who subscribes, because the move he made next killed a division in a single morning. By the first week of January 1942, the 11th Indian Division had been retreating and fighting for a month without rest. It had been rebuilt on paper and was exhausted in fact. It now stood astride the trunk road at Trolac and Slim River, in thick country, under a heavy monsoon, and it was the last organized force between the Japanese and Kuala Lumpur. The British calculation was a reasonable one. Armor could not operate at night on a single narrow road with jungle pressing in on both sides, and the road itself would be blocked, mined, and covered by anti-tank weapons. What that calculation did not survive was contact with Major Toyosaku Shimada of the 6th Tank Regiment, who proposed exactly the thing the defenders had ruled out. He would take about 20 tanks, most of them mediums, and drive straight down the trunk road in darkness with infantry riding and running behind him, and he would not stop for anything that did not stop him. At 3:30 in the morning on the 7th of January, in pouring rain, the bombardment came down on the forward battalion, the 4th 19th Hyderabad Regiment. The first roadblock was breached in about 15 minutes. The 5th 2nd Punjab fought the next position until roughly 6 o'clock and took the leading tank out with a mine, and a second with anti-tank rifle fire, and a third with petrol bombs, and it made no difference at all, because the column simply kept moving. Half an hour later, the tanks reached Trolac, where the 2nd Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders heard tracks in the dark and took them for their own carriers coming back. They were overrun where they stood. By 8 o'clock, Japanese tanks were driving through the headquarters area of the 28th Gurkha Brigade, shooting up transport and cutting signal lines, and the brigade ceased to exist as a command in a matter of minutes. At 8:30, the leading tanks reached the road bridge over the Slim River. Beaufort's gunners engaged them over open sights, and the light shells failed to penetrate. Lieutenant Watanabe climbed down onto the bridge under fire, found the demolition wires, and cut them through with his sword. The bridge, the one object on which the entire British withdrawal now depended, was taken intact. A 3-tank probe pushed on another 4 kilometers beyond the river. At about 9:30, 2 miles below the bridge, it ran into a 4.5-inch howitzer of the 155th Field Regiment, the Lanarkshire Yeomanry, laid over open sights at a range of about 30 yards. The gunners destroyed the leading tank at point-blank range, killed its commander, and turned the survivors back. It was the first thing that had stopped the Japanese since 3:30 that morning. In 6 hours, Shimada had driven 19 miles through a division sitting in position and had taken 2 bridges, all of it before lunch. British and Indian losses came to about 500 killed and 3,200 taken prisoner, which is better understood as more than 600 men lost for every hour the attack lasted. Japanese losses were 77 killed, 60 wounded, and 4 tanks. The next morning, the 12th Brigade could parade about 430 men, of whom 94 were Argylls. The 28th Gurkha Brigade could find some 750. The 2nd 1st Gurkhas answered roll call with 1 officer and 27 other ranks. The British artillery commander, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Harrison, wrote afterwards that the Japanese tank crews, heedless of danger and of their own isolation, had shattered the division and had taken the Slim Bridge by reckless and gallant determination. Kuala Lumpur fell 4 days later. Central Malaya was abandoned, and General Wavell concluded that the peninsula could no longer be held and that everything must fall back into Johor, and then onto the island. And again, exactly as at Jitra, the enemy had lost not because he was outnumbered, but because he had decided in advance what the Japanese could not possibly do. Slim River was the price of that decision, paid in a single morning by 2 brigades that never fought again. By the end of January 1942, the causeway had been blown, and the last Commonwealth troops were on Singapore Island. What remained was a garrison of 85,000 men and more, holding a position the world had spent 20 years calling impregnable. The great 15-inch guns of the island are often said to have pointed the wrong way. They did not. They could traverse north, and they fired 194 rounds across the strait. The problem was that they were stocked with armor-piercing shell meant for warships, which buried itself in soft earth and failed to burst, and that the northern shore of the Johor Strait had almost no fixed defenses at all, because for 2 decades nobody in authority had seriously believed an army would arrive from behind. Against that garrison, Yamashita had roughly 30,000 men on the ground, a supply line stretching 600 miles back up the peninsula, about 18 tanks still running, and an artillery park so short of shell that his guns were being rationed to something in the region of 100 rounds a day. He was outnumbered by more than 3 to 1. He could not afford a siege, and he could not afford a street battle. He needed the island in days. So he lied about where he was going. On the 7th of February, some 400 men of the Imperial Guards landed on Pulau Ubin, off the northeastern corner of the island, exactly where Percival already expected the blow to fall, and Percival duly kept his freshest and strongest formation, the British 18th Division, waiting in the northeast for an attack that was never coming. Yamashita then established himself in the tower of the Sultan of Johor's palace at Bukit Serene, a mile across the water, in full view of the British lines, with the whole northwestern shore laid out beneath him. He had calculated that the British would not shell the private property of a friendly ruler. He was right, and he directed the assault from a window. On the night of the 8th of February, after the heaviest bombardment the campaign had seen, the 5th and 18th Divisions crossed the Johor Strait in collapsible boats and landed in the Sarambun sector in the northwest, where the water was narrowest and the mangrove creeks covered the approach. 13,000 men came ashore in the first wave against roughly 3,000 Australians of the 8th Division under Major General Gordon Bennett, spread thin over a frontage no 2 brigades could have held. 10,000 more followed within hours. On the following night, the Imperial Guards attacked at Kranji and paid for it when oil released from the Woodlands Depot caught fire on the water and burned men alive in their boats. The attack went in regardless. From the 10th to the 12th of February, the fighting swung around Bukit Timah, the high ground of the island and the site of the main supply depots, and when it was finished, the Japanese held both. On the 14th, they took the reservoirs and the pumping stations. Nearly 1 million people were now crowded into the last strip of the island still under British control. Some 7,000 civilians had already been killed, and the water had days left in it. Losing Singapore was not the loss of a colony. It was the loss of the naval base that the entire British position east of Suez had been built around, and every man in Percival's headquarters understood it. What none of them understood was that Yamashita was at the end of his tether. He said afterwards that his attack on Singapore had been a bluff, and a bluff that worked. He had 30,000 men and was outnumbered more than 3 to 1. He knew that if he had to fight long for Singapore, he would be beaten. That is why the surrender had to be at once. He said he was frightened the whole time that the British would discover his numerical weakness and his lack of supplies, and force him into a street battle he could not win. And that is why, when the two commanders finally sat down across a table in the Ford Motor Factory at Bukit Timah, on the evening of the 15th of February, Yamashita refused to negotiate anything whatsoever. Percival asked to keep 1,000 armed men to maintain order. Yamashita wanted one word. He told the Japanese public afterwards that the only thing he said to the British commander during the whole negotiation was that all he wanted to hear was yes or no. Percival said yes quietly, and the guns stopped that evening. About 80,000 men surrendered at Singapore, bringing the total taken in the campaign to roughly 130,000, the largest capitulation in British history. Yamashita had covered 650 miles in 70 days, an average of better than 9 miles a day, against an enemy in position, and had taken close to 2,000 prisoners for every day of the campaign, at a cost of somewhere near 9,600 Japanese killed and wounded across the whole of Malaya. Churchill called it the worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British history, and told his doctor months later that he could not get over Singapore. One of the very few commanders of that war who had achieved anything comparable was Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, who almost exactly 1 year earlier had taken 30,000 men across Cyrenaica, annihilated an Italian army 5 times his size, and bagged some 130,000 prisoners at Beda Fomm. Both men won by movement where movement was thought impossible. Both were then removed from the theater they had won. For Yamashita, the reward was exile. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo saw a rival in the celebrity the Japanese press had built for the Tiger of Malaya, and in July of 1942, Yamashita was sent to command the 1st Area Army in Manchukuo, forbidden leave in Tokyo, kept from his wife, and never permitted to read the victory speech he had written for the emperor. He would not hold a field command again until Tojo himself had fallen, and by then there was nothing left to command but the ruin of the Philippines. The greatest land victory in the history of the Japanese army had been won in 70 days by a man who was outnumbered, out of shells and bluffing, and his own government buried him for it. Whether the greater feat was the drive down the peninsula or the bluff that took the fortress is worth settling in the comments, along with the commander who should come next, and anyone who subscribes will get him.